Okay, we're ready to begin. I'm a little blinded by the lights, so if I'm squinting at you, that's the reason. And I'll be looking at the slides here and sticking pretty close to them. This is the result of over 30 years of wrestling with Babylon and why the Bible is so hard on Babylon, why it's singled out. Why doesn't some other city in the ancient Near East get spanked like Babylon does? And I did my doctoral program in that, and so I'm trying to distill the massive amount of study I've done in a few minutes. So bear with me, fasten your seatbelts, because we're going to have to move quickly. I start with some premises of the study. Ancient Mesopotamia is credited with the earliest cities, with Babylon becoming the first metropolis. The Bible doesn't like cities, especially Genesis, and there's a reason for that. Mesopotamia also may have been the first to develop writing, legal institutions, kingship, and economics. Mesopotamia influenced civilizations to the east and to the west. This is a fairly new field that's opened up in Assyriology, where they have studied influences beyond the Euphrates River. Babylonians viewed the gods as like their earthly kings, using similar legal and economic systems and generally behaving pretty much as petty, selfish human beings behave. The Bible contains an anti-Babylonian polemic throughout it that is especially strong in Genesis and Revelation, the bookends of the canon. Those are my premises. Without those premises, you might get a little lost in what I'm going to present. My methodology that I have begun to develop is what I call canonical criticism. That is a field of hermeneutics in which we take the canon. I follow Brevard Childs in taking the canon in its finished form. And I believe within that hermeneutic tradition that the Bible speaks in two voices. First, the minor voice of God's preferred will, and secondly, the major voice of his will adapted to the will of the people. Jesus illustrates this principle in Matthew 19 when he deals with the divorce laws. He says, God allowed you to divorce your wives because of the stiffness of your necks and the hardness of your hearts. But in the beginning, it was not so. And this is how Jesus interpreted the Old Testament. And this is a result of actually not Jesus, but actually seeing a pattern within the text. So what I have come, because of this pattern, to see is that the minor voice of divine preference is tied to creation. Creation is the starting place. It's the place you begin, and you view everything against its light. It speaks first in a thematic narrative sequence. This is the pattern that I noticed repeatedly in the Old Testament. And it stands out as a unique in the ancient Near East. A lot of the Bible, much of the Old Testament, harmonizes with the ancient Near East. But there are these points, that's why I call them minor, these points in which the Bible stands out uniquely. It also speaks again in the New Testament, often very clearly, though you do have vestiges of the major voice in the New Testament. So this study, I'm going to use two of those criteria. A fuller study could do more. But the application I use here is creation and the uniqueness in the ancient Near East, particularly the latter. If we look at the Hebrew Bible and we look at creation as containing the models God intended us to use, He created three models: nature, the business, with understanding of natural law, interconnection, self-control, responsibility, love, nurture, and unselfishness. The second model is family, also having these same elements, but also intimacy, trust, teamwork, and development. The Sabbath, inclusion and equality. Remember, the animals get to rest as well as human beings. God shares his rest with human beings. Rest and freedom and time for relationships. Those are the models that God intended us to use in our understanding of him. Babylonia, or I should say a little piece here, there's another assumption I'm making. The Bible, when it talks about Babylon, often assumes its history clear back to Sumer. So when the Bible deals with Babylon, it doesn't necessarily differentiate. For example, the Tower of Babel story takes place in the land of Shinar. Shinar is Hebrew for Sumer. So the Bible actually does combine these things. So Babylon invented, or I should say Babylonia, or maybe Mesopotamia would be more accurate, invented three models that are institutions for how we do things. First is economics. And you can see, I hope, that in economics nothing is fixed or stable. It is arbitrary. We have substitution, competition, inflation, objectification, and slavery. Those are the byproducts of economics. And it developed kingship, or hierarchy, the importance of power, rule over instead of power under. And the external locus of control becomes paramount. And one of the things I'm going to be featuring today, angry kings must be appeased. It also invented legal structures with an appeal to external motivation, compliance through fear, and enforcement through penalties. Now, my students have sometimes gotten troubled by that. Why do you appeal to legal structures? Shouldn't that be on God's side? Didn't God have the law? Well, as I've shown you, God's law is natural. In fact, I find it more natural than natural law. God has offset natural law from time to time. So there can be changes, but moral law is unchanging. And so it's more natural than natural law. These models that we inherited from Babylonia are with us to this day. And it's true we don't have kings, but we do. You know, let's face it, we have people trying to be kings in our society. But these models have shaped the way we think, have shaped the way we internalize things, have shaped our value system, and so on. I don't want to get sidetracked here. I was planning to go through this slide very quickly because I knew it would otherwise take a lot of time. But these are the models that have shaped our understanding of atonement. I'm going to skip this slide except to point out that the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11 is about substitution. Now, I find creation, and this is getting into my canonical critical method, creation is foundational to atonement. Our view of atonement should harmonize with our view of creation. And the reason I came to this conclusion is because I compared the Babylonian creation story, called Enuma Elish by the Babylonians, with the Genesis creation story, particularly Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. There are several features that are very clearly contrasted between these two stories. In the Hebrew Bible, creation transforms chaos. In Babylon, chaos, or Tiamat, is slain for creation. So someone has to die in order to give life. In fact, that motif is followed 3 times in the Enuma Elish. Someone has to die. And what is interesting is that creation is an act of God by divine fiat, whereas creation comes from a divine carcass. The slaying of Tiamat gives rise to the creation of the earth. In order to give life to human beings, humans are created. In order to give life from human beings, humans are created from the blood of a slain deity. And they become the substitute workforce for the gods, so that the gods don't have to work so hard. Consequently, human beings are created on God's image in Genesis, whereas in Babylon, humans are created from the blood of a slain deity, and they have to be slaves of the gods. So instead of being created in God's image in Babylon, you are created to be slaves of the gods, and that is a belief system that was there from the earliest times to the latest times. It never changed. And a lot of things changed in Mesopotamia over the years, but that one didn't. There's more words, and I'm jumping around here, but there are more words for Babylonian substitution than there are in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, I would say that substitution ties almost every aspect of Babylonian life together. So here are some examples. Kingu dies as a penalty for instigating Tiamat's rebellion, and out of his death comes human substitutionary life. In the Babylonian model, penal execution gives life to the substitute. Kingu is killed by execution. That is, he instigated the rebellion, and so they executed him. Divine and royal images acted as doubles or substitutes of the gods, so that they could exercise their power wherever their images were stationed. They were also used by kings that way. A figurine, a legal substitute, dinanu, related to din. If you want a biblical example of that term, Daniel is built on the same word. God is judge. This figurine healed the sick when it was placed on a patient and then thrown away or burnt. Imagine going to your doctor when you're sick and having him offer you a dinanu. Ishtar could not leave the netherworld without a substitute. And then there's the famous Assyrian and then later Babylonian practice of the sharpuki. My students always love that term. The sharpuki, or substitute king, that was executed in place of the real king when the omens suggested that the gods were angry with the real king. Biblical substitution. I already mentioned that while Akkadian has 3 or 4 nouns for substitute, Hebrew has none, just loose constructions. In the sacrificial system, the sinner normally did the slaying of the animal, not the priest. My students always think the priest must have done it. After all, didn't God kill his son? But for that reason, because the sinner did the killing, they own the culpability for the death of the animal. So rooted in the sacrificial system is the belief that we are responsible for the death of this innocent animal, i.e., we are responsible for the death of Jesus. The suffering servant is not a perfect parallel of the Assyro-Babylonian substitute king, because the substitute king bears the omens of the real king, while the suffering servant bears the sins of the people. But I would like to propose to you further that we should read around verses 6 and 7, I believe it is. We esteemed him smitten, afflicted by God, and abused, but he was wounded by our transgressions, he was bruised by our iniquities. And I'm translating the preposition there as by, which is perfectly permissible in the Hebrew. And so the contrast is, we thought God was doing this to him, but we were the ones doing it to him through our sins. And the point of the binding of Isaac, which is why I said I was hoping to touch on this and possibly give some bit of help. The point of the binding of Isaac is, Father, do not lay your hand upon the son. And the reason I have father there is the role of Abraham is the father offering his son. Just as many people believe that God the Father is going to kill his son, or did kill his son, so Abraham is supposed to kill his son. So, but the keynote is, Father, do not lay your hand upon your son. Do not do anything to him. The whole story shifts at this point. And now Abraham's role changes. He is not the father of the ram. He is now the sinner, owning the fact that his sins have killed this innocent creature. Typologically, substitution, I believe, is revelatory rather than penal. One of the main motifs of Enuma Elish is rest. Rest has varying connotations throughout the work, not the least of which is appeasement. The use of this motif contrasts quite sharply with the Sabbath rest of Genesis 2 and Exodus 20. Appeasement of the gods formed a central organizing theological motif for Assyrians and Babylonians alike. Gods were often angry and fierce. Nearly every religious ritual and practice in some way existed to appease divine anger. Both the Hebrew biblical writers and the Septuagint translators carefully avoided using kippur, the word for atone, to mean appeasement. The Psalms likewise avoids prayers for appeasement, other than that, a few that plead for God to turn away his wrath, something he does himself. Anciently, appeasement was a form of external manipulation of divine emotion. Keep in mind, in creation model, everything's about the internal. In Babylonian models, everything is about externalism. Now I'm going to shift, because what I'm doing is telling you a story, in a sense, of how Israel became Babylonian. So we come to Babylonian influences on Judaism. The formation of the Sanhedrin goes back to Babylon. There was a circle of priests in Babylonia called the Kenishu that were probably the forerunner of Babylon. Forerunner of the formation of the Sanhedrin. This judicial body represented the same kind of judicial body that you found in the priests of the temples in Babylonia. The keeping of the Sabbath. Sabbath was originally a gift of divine rest. We turned it in, or the Jews turned it in, to a day of taboos, reflecting the evil days of the Babylonians that existed on the 7th, the 14th, the 19th, and the 21st, and the 28th. You can kind of see that there was a kind of a 7-day period between most of that. And that became the influence on Judaism, why they felt acceptable to create additional laws for the Sabbath. And also, there's the 15th day of the month, and by the way, these days are lunar days, they're not calendar days. 15th day of the month was called Shabbatu and is likely related to the word Shabbat. That's debated, of course, especially by Gerhard Hazel. but he didn't give any support for it. But most Assyriologists believe that they're related. This day was referred to as the day of the resting of the heart, and that means appeasement. So in contrast to Sabbath as rest, you have Shabbatu, which is appeasement, and that fits very nicely with Enuma Elish and its view of rest as appeasement. More influences, rabbinic traditions, the many Sabbath laws that they created in the Talmud, and the many other laws. And by the way, Talmud is late, I realize, but it's easier to refer to. Those laws were built on the Babylonian principle of expansionism. You have a singular case. How many ways should we apply it? So let's expand it. You shouldn't kindle a fire on the Sabbath day. So you cannot kindle a fire here or there or another place, or you cannot do this or that or the other thing that involves a fire. That's the principle of expansionism. The lex talionis, the law of retaliation. A lot of people think that the law of retaliation was invented to alleviate wanton killing and destruction. And there may be some truth to that, but in Babylonia, that's far from the truth. Originally, punishments were pecuniary. That is, you paid a fine if you broke into someone's house and stole. Hammurabi, the sixth king of the first dynasty of Babylon, and innovatively brought into his laws the lex talionis. So we can credit Hammurabi with inventing this. Now, he may have brought his Amorite culture with him, and that may have given rise to that, but we don't know that because we don't have enough Amorite texts that suggest it. Moses and Hammurabi, the Jews usually saw Moses more as a deliverer from slavery than as a lawgiver in their early periods. As they got closer and closer to Babylon, not just in exile, but in thinking, and that started early, before they ever went to Babylonian exile. As they got closer and closer, they thought, Hammurabi is a great king and a great lawgiver in Babylon. We have a great lawgiver and a leader in our midst, and he's Moses. And so Moses became the icon that Hammurabi was to the Babylonians. By the way, I think my outline is coming around, so you have something to take notes with and kind of follow along. I don't know what page I'm on, sorry. I'll let you try to find that. The role of the scribe. Scribes were originally writers that wrote things for people. But during the Neo-Babylonian period, the scribes became a class of people who were legal specialists. They sometimes even held court and presided as judges. That seems to be what happened to the scribes in Israel. So by Jesus' day, the scribes are legal experts of the law. By the way, when you see the term scribes and Pharisees, that term is not scribes and Pharisees, but scribes, even Pharisees. You see, what happened is that the scribes were viewed as the legal experts by themselves. They referred to themselves as scribes. But the Sadducees, who didn't like the Pharisees, called them Pharisees as a derogatory term. Perceptions of misfortune. Babylonians believed, now they did believe sometimes in cause and effect relationships, but the prevailing view seems to have been that all misfortune, all problems anything, any pain or suffering that you experience comes from the gods. And you can see that in the New Testament with Jesus in John 9 having to set the record straight. You can also see it in Job in the Old Testament. Signs. Why were the Pharisees always asking for signs from Jesus? Jesus performs the miracle of the 5,000, feeding the 5,000, and they ask him for a sign. What? He just gave them a sign. What's the problem? Well, they drag Moses into it. You know, Moses gave us a sign in the wilderness. He gave us bread to eat. Where's your sign? Well, he just gave them a sign. What's the problem? The problem is that in Babylonia, where they inherited, and they dragged this all home to Jerusalem, of course. And in Babylonia, a sign was an omen. And an omen wasn't just forecasting the future. An omen was a legal verdict on the part of gods telling you what your fate was going to be. And they were negotiable. I mean, you could negotiate with your God to change the omen. But they were still legal verdicts. And so what they are asking for is not a sign in sense of just a miracle. They want Jesus to apply himself to Moses and fit under Moses' rubric, because that is the legal sign they want him to give before they will believe him. The Babylonians saw the gods as remote, unapproachable, not able to be understood. And I give you a quotation here from Botero on that remoteness and the fear-based religion that they had. Although much of the time they could ignore the gods. Fear has a way of desensitizing us. We become so accustomed to it that we don't act in a state of absolute terror all the time. We become kind of adjusted, and so consequently, we can ignore someone we're afraid of as well as try to placate them. I propose to you that Jesus took on Babylon in many ways. The blessings and cursings of the covenant in Deuteronomy parallel Assyrian treaties. The power of the treaty was backed by the angry gods who would inflict pain on you if you did not keep the treaty. And if you broke the treaty, the gods would be quick to retaliate, as well as the king, because you had violated and sinned against the God of the king, who was your suzerain, that is your overlord. Interestingly, Exodus has no curses or blessings. Jesus does not give any blessings or cursings. In the Beatitudes, he says, "Happy are you," an intrinsic term. Happy are you, instead of blessed are you. I know most translations translate blessed, but the word is happy. It's used in the Psalms, not in covenant language. And for the curses, Jesus uses the word woe, another intrinsic term. Other takes on Babylon. Jesus rejects the lex talionis, the eye for eye and tooth for tooth, in the Sermon on the Mount. When he does that, he's striking at the heart of Babylon. In the sixth king of Hammurabi. By the way, if you think, well, that was so far ago, Hammurabi lived about the time of Abraham. So how could there be any connection? You need to know that Nebuchadnezzar II, the king of Neo-Babylonian period, actually resurrected Hammurabi and tried to emulate him as king. and he had his scribes copy Hammurabi's laws, which contained the lex talionis. The Neo-Babylonian period is the period of the exile. Repetitious prayers. Babylonian prayers tended to heap up empty phrases, as Jesus said, and so he had them, he said, don't do that. Don't be Babylonian. Don't heap up empty phrases. In his new covenant, Jesus spends considerable space for the kingdom of heaven. He deals with economy by saying, don't take a thought for what you're going to eat or drink or what you're going to wear, because your heavenly Father knows all your needs. In Atonement, Jesus nowhere speaks of his death in terms of appeasement or penal substitution. He tells his disciples that the unbelieving Jews will crucify him. He speaks in terms of drawing all to himself. Jesus tells sinners that he would no way cast out those who come to him. He told Nicodemus that anyone who trusted in him would have eternal life. John says that Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil. There's nowhere that Jesus states that he's going to die a death that will pay a price to the Father. Now, I'm going to skip these quotes because it would take me a long time to read them. But these are quotes that are almost, you could juxtapose them against Babylonian quotes and have a nice opposition. So this goes on several pages. Maybe you can catch a few of them as I move slowly through. I will highlight this one. Jesus says, pray in this way. By the way, the faint red is Babylon. Jesus says, pray in this way. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The gods say to Marduk in Enuma Elish, Lord, spare the life of anyone who surrenders to you. Pour out the life of the god who seized evil. The gods then set a constellation before him and order, command and destroy and create. May they be established. When he does this, they proclaim Marduk is king. I think I said the wrong thing. I got out of order. The real contrast is this top one. Let him, Marduk, do on earth a likeness of what he has done in heaven. Let him assign the black-headed to worship him. This is the opposite of what Jesus says to pray. So when the gods say, create and destroy, Jesus says, God loved the world so much that he gave his only son, that those who believe in him might not destroy themselves. That is a permissible reading, I believe, of the Greek, because it's a middle voice. And the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I come that they might have life. A lot of this juxtaposes Jesus' servanthood against power. So what happens when Jesus counters Babylon? Babylon crucifies him. I don't agree with everything Margaret Barker says and how she arrives at this, but Margaret Barker has written a number of things suggesting that it was the Babylonian Jews that are the Jews in John's Gospel. That is, they're the Jews that inherited the Babylonian ideology. You need to know that in the history of the Talmud, there are two Talmuds. There's the Jerusalem Talmud and there's the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud was done by Jews in Babylonia who then later brought it to Jerusalem. And of course, it was oral at the time they brought it and developed it. It only later became written down. So Here are the elements or issues that led to Jesus' arrest and death. His way of keeping Sabbath that defied their expansionist Sabbath laws that made the Sabbath a taboo day. The reception of expansionist, okay, I already said that. A rejection of Hammurabi's lex talionis. A downplay of Moses. Jesus kind of puts Moses down as a human being instead of deifying him. Reception of misfortune as divine punishment. Refusal to bow to the scribes and Sadducees as authoritative. Refusal to provide a legally acceptable sign. Friendship, conversation, intimacy, portrayal of God as approachable, not angry and needing appeasement. Love and service, not authority and power. I'm going to have to read this very carefully. The substitute king ritual existed in Babylonia when Alexander the Great made his way toward that city. When the diviners discovered omens against the king, the Babylonian priests wanted to perform it on behalf of Alexander. Like most ancient Near Eastern cultures, the Babylonians believed that the equilibrium of the entire country rested upon the king's safety. It is in a well-known perception of the king. In a well-known perception, if the king went down, his city faced destruction. So here's Caiaphas. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." Now, John goes on to say that was a wonderful prophecy of what Jesus came to do. And Ellen White echoes that in Desire of Ages, but she goes on to say, but on the lips of Caiaphas, this wonderful truth was turned into a lie. And she talks about human sacrifice and how Caiaphas was actually appealing to that ancient view. Well, it makes sense that he would, if he was aware, clear not so long ago in the Seleucid period, that they were practicing the Sharpuki ritual. So he is appealing, I believe, here to the Sharpuki as a basis for putting Jesus to death. Now, this is where I do think Isaiah 53 may be applying and actually using the Sharpuki ritual in the sense that he is foretelling that this ritual is going to be used on the suffering servant. The trial of Jesus. Background. In ancient Assyro-Babylonian courts resorted to divine legal proof to find a person's guilt or innocence, one of which was the judicial oath sworn at the temple before deity. The court might state to the guilty one, "You claim to have done such and such," to which the party on trial would swear by the God, "I have not done such and such." Actually, they would swear to the God, "I have not done such and such." The courts regarded this oath of supreme importance in deciding cases because they believed the gods ensured it, thus making it conclusive of guilt or innocence, because those swearing would not likely perjure themselves before the God. In the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, first millennia and a period of the exile, the use of such oaths began to wane because of a preference for rational evidence, primarily through witnesses. This was more of a shift toward a legal view of trial. It also was not always viewed as dispositive, capable of settling guilt or innocence, and unlike earlier periods, could be contradicted in court processes. This change came about especially encouraged by priests in order to gain more control over the judicial process, not trusting deity to side with them. This same shift is demonstrated in the Hebrew Bible, with Exodus utilizing the judicial oath as standard practice, while Deuteronomy prefers a more forensic witness-based approach. So we come to the trial of Caiaphas and Jesus. At Jesus' trial, many false witnesses failed to achieve a shut case against Jesus' innocence. Finally, 2 men claimed that Jesus said he was able to destroy God's temple and build it in 3 days. Caiaphas tries to get Jesus to respond, but Jesus remains silent. Realizing how flimsy the case is from a forensic viewpoint and desperate to procure eyewitness testimonies, Caiaphas chooses the judicial oath as a way out. He says, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus replied, "You said so. However, I tell you in the future, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." It is clear that Caiaphas hopes to secure Jesus' condemnation by forensic, not cultic, means. It would not serve his interests to use the judicial oath to the divine verdict, since it would well deprive him and the Sanhedrin of their ability to condemn Jesus, should the divine judgment be acquittal. It would also prolong the court's decision, and they're in a great hurry. Caiaphas used the judicial oath for only one purpose. If he could get Jesus to speak and state clearly that he was the Messiah, he could secure his condemnation with the Sanhedrin, because they would serve as eyewitnesses to his testimony. But he does not state the judicial oath in the usual way. Instead of saying, "You claim to be the Messiah," Caiaphas says, "I adjure you by the living God, so that you may tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." By using the word "if," Caiaphas not only prevents himself from possible blasphemy, he also puts Jesus in a situation where he will more likely indict himself by asserting the truth. In his response, Jesus does not swear. His words, "You said," while shifting his admission to the being the Messiah and God's Son, show a disregard for Caiaphas' "if." The "you" is emphatic, suggesting Caiaphas' admission buried in his adjuration. Here Jesus supports his own injunctions not to swear any oath, but to simply say yes or no. Anything else comes from evil. Thus in Matthew, just as he does in the next few lines with Hammurabi's Canonical law, Jesus rejects all oath-taking, a very Assyrio-Babylonian convention. Including the judicial oath. In his stating what Caiaphas will see someday, Jesus carefully avoids the term Messiah and Son of God, using the term Son of Man. The term power was a popular term for God, used to avoid saying the name Yahweh. Jesus, of course, is referring to himself, but Caiaphas really can't prove it from his words. The verdict. Jesus has broken no biblical law. He has cited Daniel 7:13 and 14, but has not directly stated that he is the Son of Man. In doing so, Jesus does not deny this truth. Rather, he allows the evidence of his deeds to be his defense. He will not cooperate with the forensic basis of his trial. Someday I hope to show that God's cosmic court is non-forensic, but actually based on empirical evidence, the evidence of what the acts of God, what God does to support his case. Caiaphas exclaimed, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" Here Caiaphas shows his preference for non-forensic rather than cultic evidence. He also reflects the Neo-Babylonian focus on the verdict as the chief goal of a trial. Through opposing traditions colored by Babylonian ideologies and conventions, through the forensic procedures of the Babylonian-like Sanhedrin, and through Jesus' unwillingness to save himself by forensic means, the religious authorities condemned Jesus to a penal substitutionary death. I'm going to skip these conclusions. I hope this has been clear. Okay. Considerable evidence of Babylonian influence on Judaism. The laws that eventually helped form the Babylonian Talmud, I've already mentioned. What I'm trying to show you is that the cause of Jesus' death was the Babylonian models. And those models are with us to this day for describing that death. Theological formations of Judaism in regard to sin and suffering, all of these affected Western thought. The underlying issues and conflicts between Jews and Jesus. Ancient Assyria, Babylonia also influenced the West, Greece, Rome, and Christianity. Berosus, a Babylonian scribe in the Seleucid period, wrote a history of Babylonia. That history we only know about from two sources, Josephus, who uses it, and Eusebius, the church historian of the early Christian period. Babylon and Old Jerusalem. What I'm contrasting here, or what I'm drawing together, is that Old Jerusalem is considered Babylon by John. He considers Rome the beast. Now, I'm not trying to alter Adventist theology here. I'm simply trying to go back to John and look at it through his eyes. Rome is the beast of Revelation. Babylon sits on the beast. Babylon is Old Jerusalem. The reason he uses Babylon, and this is one of my operating beliefs, is that Babylon historically influenced Judaism. And so Babylon is to blame. Babylon is where we got off from a God of gift-giving and grace in the Garden of Eden to a God of economics, kingship, and law. And those motifs, those models, are the ones we've been wrestling with this weekend. They are Babylonian in origin. So the Bible opposes Babylon for historical reasons, not just the exile. Babylon represents an apostate religion opposite to the New Jerusalem. To John, this would seem to be Old Jerusalem, is influenced by Babylonian ideologies. The beast for John would then be Rome, which Old Jerusalem had to sit on in order to crucify Jesus. They had to use Rome in order to get permission to crucify Jesus. Therefore, John calls to Old Jerusalem to come out of the Babylonian ways of thinking that had led them to crucify their Messiah. The call for John was given to my people, a term that biblically refers to the Jewish people, telling them to come out of the Babylonian influences that they had retained. That's my caveat too. Back to the ancient models for relationships. This is what we're dealing with. The Babylonians invented the kinds that we're so familiar with and the kinds that have so permeated theology in the Christian community. And I'm going to show you, I don't think it's on this slide. In my next presentation, this will become clearer when I deal with divine anger. Because the wine of the wrath of her fornication is in parallel and in contrast to the wine of the wrath of God. And so I'm going to be showing you that this all comes together in the call to come out of Babylon. The call to come out of Babylon is to come out of these Babylonian models. But at the same time, that call is given in distinctly Babylonian ways. And I'll be showing you that this afternoon. So we have these models. The ones God would prefer us to use, his divine voice of preference, is that we use the ones on the left, the creation models. But because we are all, and I'm saying all, I think all of us have been to varying degrees permeated by Babylonian influences. God has chosen in the Bible to speak Babylonian. And in other ways. I mean, there's other cultures there that he also speaks in, their language. So the call to come out of Babylon means to portray God as one who is, to come as not arbitrary, who values us. It's to come out of the belief system that God is one who is arbitrary, who values us as economic objects, who made us to be his slaves, who have no rest day or night. Like an earthly king ruling over others, controlling them and serving, regardless of how sinful, as the image of divinity. Like a judge sending divine verdicts down to us as signs and punishing us frequently for our sins, and who can be legally satisfied by substitution. That's the call to come out of all of that and to return to the Creator and his creation, whose spiritual and moral laws operate by the intrinsic cause-effect and thus describe the way things work. Jesus died to demonstrate this. Who, as the Father of all humanity, seeks to nurture an intimate relationship of love and trust, Jesus died to win us back to trust. He gave us, we are to return to a God who gave us his Sabbath to provide non-hierarchical, non-economic, and natural relationships of freedom and equality.
Stay close by, stay close by. Give her a hand. What a why is this not going on?
Try the other one. I think it's on.
Here we go. Wow. Jean. So you are saying that if we accept a Babylonian model of the gods that have to be pacified and substitution and all of that, that even if you're in a Christian church and you are buying into that model, you will have to come out from that.
Ultimately, there's a timing to that. You see, it's what I was saying last night about growing something to maturity. Both systems of thought have to come to maturity.
Will at the end of the world, then, all who are going to be translated in trust to God have had to come out from a Babylonian understanding of substitution.
I think those two will stop intertwining for us and become separate and become clear. And in that clarity, when the knowledge of the Lord covers the earth like the waters cover the sea, there will be a coming out. Mm-hmm.
So there's no compromise, no halfway station.
At
You're
that
either
time.
fully trusting and in a loving, trusting relationship with God, or you're into the Babylonian, I got to pay off God.
Yeah. At the end of time.
At the end. Interesting. All right, Tim. You need to sit right here at the front, Tim.
I always have a question. So you made the case, and first off, I want to tell you, brilliant, loved it. Okay, but you made the case that Jerusalem for John ended up being Babylon because they incorporated all these Babylonian constructs with an imperialistic God who was basically needed to be appeased. With Adventist theology and looking into our Daniel Revelation programs, are you then saying the Seventh-day Adventist Church is now Babylon, as we are that remnant people to take a world, and if we take and put that same imperialistic, appeasement, punishing God out to the world, are we now taking the Babylonian message to the world?
Last year I taught for the first time a new class called Babylon in the Bible. And I had my students read the text and read the Bible. And what was amazing to me, it was a class of about 18 students, which is pretty good for the first time you offer a class. We sat in a circle and I asked for their questions and helped them understand, but most of them had already gotten what I see just from reading. I didn't prime the pump. I didn't tell them what to look for. They got it. And that was their question at the end of class. And I, as a loyal Seventh-day Adventist teacher, I'm careful what I say and answer. I don't think we're there yet. I see the Holy Spirit still working in the church. The last annual council, to me, suggested we have more time.
Another little moment for us to think about. We'll try not to think too hard. Is the substitutionary model that you're applying to sort of a Babylonian label, is that a satanic lie to try to completely distort and discredit the true God? Or is it a halfway stop that God, through Anselm and all the others, used in order to give people some peace and comfort on their way to a better picture of God?
You can look at it both ways. You can look at it as a way stop, or you can look at it as a descent into the darkness of the Middle Ages. I have to point out that if you look at John Carroll's Constantine's Sword, the book on Constantine, John Carroll is a Roman Catholic writer. He purports that there's a link between Anselm and the First Crusade.
And
the First Crusade.
In what way?
He was composing it while Pope Leo, a good friend of his, was planning the First Crusade.
And your point is what?
My point is that this is part of the theology in the stream of consciousness affecting the church that allows them to kill people in the name of God.
Wow. Wow. Interesting. All right, Miss Arla.
So what I hear you saying is that you want us to just realize how much we're influenced by all these pagan ideas. Great job.
Yeah, again, and I'm going to show this afternoon, God has always spoken Babylonian when needed. And I don't want to cheat on what I'm going to do this afternoon by starting to talk about it. But, the three angels' messages start out with creation and judgment. So there's a little bit of this legal element, it would seem. But not as much. Worship him who made heavens, earth, the seas, and so on. And then you move to Babylon has fallen, and it's like, what? Well, if you reject the first message, you need the second one because you've gone to Babylon.
Well, let's be real practical here. You know my brother, who his son was here leading last night. He's a pastor in El Cajon, watching by live streaming right now.
Okay.
And as he became a character of God person, he took hymns out of the hymnal and pasted new hymns on top of them in all the hymnals in the church so that power in the blood wouldn't be there anymore. And there war in the church. And Sabbath school teachers who taught that had to be, somewhere else. And it just was a very difficult time. Can there be a group of people who love Jesus, and Jesus has forgiven them and saved them from the Anselm penal substitutionary model, and clear till Jesus comes, they just love Jesus, and that's all they know. But they love Jesus. And when they walk off the cloud, they will love Jesus.
Well, I believe
or
that.
will they all end up, because they have that picture of God, end up going away from God?
Remember, I'm talking about the end of time.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Will the people who have that picture of God and believe Jesus protects them from that or whatever, have to give that up and come in love with the true God in order to go into the cloud?
The litmus test is how they treat everyone. God never, when he does the sheep and the goats, he doesn't say, what was your theology? He says, how do you treat people? Our real theology, okay, let me say this.
So the theology will affect your behavior, and that'll be the test.
Well, here's the thing. What we say about God is what we hope is true about him. How we treat other people is what we really believe about him. That's our true theology.
Well, there's also a design law about the holding. We become changed. We become like the God we admire and worship. And so this is where you're talking about at the end. It's saying your character is revealed by how you treat people, and your character is developed by which God you worship. And if you worship the God who's like Jesus, you become like that. But if you worship the divine dictator who's the source of inflicted pain and suffering, then you go off to the crusades and you kill people.
Just 20-second anecdote. I was pastoring in Chicago, preached that, and said we will treat people the way we see God. Former pastor, divorced and all that, came out my door and said, I don't agree with that, fought me on it. And I got a call a few weeks later from the school, and his son had whiplash all over his back. And the father was whipping his son. And it was true. And he did treat his son the way he saw God. Anyway, it doesn't mean everybody, but there was one pretty clear example.
That's a dramatic example.
Yes.
The thing is, I think there will be a lot of Babylonians in heaven.
Say some more.
Well, if we believe that you don't have to be just a Christian to be saved, and if God could save the thief on the cross, who knows what his theology was?
Yes.
He got a better picture in a few seconds.
Some people's picture of God will change as they know Jesus on the way to heaven.
And I think again, the litmus test was how they treated people, because you have a lot of people with a terrible picture of God who treat people just wonderfully.
Okay. Anyone else? Oh, hey, Alden.
My colleague Ernie Bursey has been laboring with me in the contrast in Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5. You have heard, rather than but I say, closer to you have heard and I say, which would suggest that the lex talionis, which I have understood to be a limitation of revenge, rather than encouraging of revenge, is a halfway house, not an end in itself.
Okay, here's my take on that. That might be true in the very early periods before writing was invented, but in the Babylonian, in the Sumerian and Babylonian cultures, you have penalties that are fines. They're pecuniary, they're monetary. Hammurabi introduced the lex talionis in law. So it is an innovation, and that's why I see Jesus taking it apart. Lex talionis did not figure as a prominent overarching principle of the Hebrew Bible. It's used only 3 times, and it's applied to specific laws as a part of explaining those laws and how they function. He has his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In narrative, however, it's quite clear that sinful human beings don't follow eye for an eye, ear for a tooth. They cut off your head if you stomp on their foot. So how do we deal with that reality of human vengeance and the biblical record to, maybe it was early, but to try to limit that?
The Babylonian model is what we invented because we couldn't trust one another. The Christian isn't the state. Paul clearly makes it clear in Romans that the state does what the state has to do, and that they adjudicate the problem of distrust. But Christians are not the state, and we are to use other methods and to believe in a better way. I'm separating church and state here.
That's why the social justice approach to the cross is a corruption of the cross, because it goes through human state systems to try to fix the social problems, rather than changing the hearts of men to be like Christ and love everybody.
I personally believe in restorative justice as the model, and that's being used actually in the courts. In some cases, I read a story of a parent whose their daughter's boyfriend shot her and killed her in an argument that lasted, I think, over 24 hours, nonstop. And instead of putting him behind bars, they attempted to do restorative justice, and they had to hire a special, very expensive lawyer from San Francisco in order to do that. But their goal was to redeem, not to just punish.
Gene and I have been friends for what, 25, 30 years on the character of God with Barbara and others.
It's thanks to Barbara.
Just going to tell you a little anecdote that was right in this room. John Henderson is the chaplain at PUC, must be what, in his early 40s, give or take, was a student at PUC at 19 years old and was a star preacher. Spoke all over the country, spoke at our church at La Sierra, on campus, just a star, 19 years old. A few years ago, they had a week in Alaska. All of our best Adventist preachers, Randy Roberts, Dwight Nelson, the guy down at Carlton Bird, all these guys, 7 preachers preached one night a week for this 1 week of a big camp meeting that was videotaped to all of us. And John Henderson was in there. And it was one of the greatest picture of God sermons I've ever heard on Zacchaeus. We was going to preach that this weekend when he couldn't come. And I happen to know that 19-year-old student slipped up to a small office in the religion department and was mentored by this short little Old Testament teacher. She was not one of the speakers with Dwight Nelson and Randy Roberts and the rest of them. But a student she mentored at 19 years old and gave him a picture of God now was preached all over the world through John Henderson. Amen? The power of a godly teacher and a picture of God. She may never get any credit till this minute, but a great picture of God. Thank you. And I love her and proud of her, so John is here in another way. Anyway, thank you, Jean, for this, and we'll look forward. She gave the one this afternoon. She gave in our house one time as she was practicing for the West Coast teachers. So all my young sons and all their friends. So the minor and major voices of God. We'll hear some more this afternoon. We're a little bit off schedule. If you can just, can you take 5 minutes and take a break?